I've had a really, really hard time trying to figure out what it is I want to say here, because I have been thinking about this for a while. I mean, on the one hand, there's so much that needs to be done in this realm, and it excites me, and actually hearing all of this stuff today is sort of remotivating me. But on the other hand, and I do want to talk about this, I got a bit of fatigue in this space a few years ago, mostly from political theorists, not pointing at you, but from political theorists, especially liberal political theorists. And I'll talk a bit about that. So the end really is that I'm sort of underprepared to give this talk because I guess I'm overcautious, though I really don't need to be in this room. So, I mean, I've written a bit on multi-species justice. I started writing on ecological justice or justice in the non-human realm, including rivers, about a decade ago, maybe. And I guess it's just in the community of political theorists where that work has been painful. So I guess to sort of encapsulate that work before going on to some of the new stuff I want to talk about, I guess my work has really focused on pluralizing justice in two different domains, or maybe I'll use constellations now. So one of the crucial things that I've tried to do, and in all of this I'm informed by activists, and this is sort of another part of, my methodology is actually listening to the way that activists and people raising concepts like injustice actually talk about the term and define the term. So that's been a major influence of mine. But one of the main things that I've done is sort of expand the notion of justice, the concept of justice. And a lot of that has to do, and again, it's a critique of liberal political theory as well, it's just moving beyond the concept of equity as an all-encompassing notion of justice. And it's heartening, again, in this room all day to hear the word recognition come up again and again, and how important recognition is as an element of multi-species justice, not just recognizing other subjects, but recognizing the way that human beings include recognition, not as a notion of justice, and include other beings in their conceptions. We've heard a lot of talk about procedural justice, participation, inclusion, the all-affected principle of democracy. I mean, all of that is absolutely crucial to notions of justice. And then, of course, I've dealt a bit with a capabilities notion, which gets at integrity and functioning of systems and individuals. And so all these concepts of justice is one of the things that I've been trying to do, not just within environmental justice, but within ecological justice as well. When we talk about justice to the non-human, the conceptualization of justice has to be broad and plural as well. But the other thing I've done, so that plurality is absolutely key, but the other thing I've been trying to do is on this subject of justice, and not just beyond the human individual to non-human individuals. And this gets me in a lot of trouble with a different crowd because I'm really not interested in animals as individual subjects. I'm more interested in non-human systems and communities, even up to the planetary, but maybe not as a singular whole, but just as one of many subjects of justice. So, I mean, I guess the reasoning here is if we continue to limit the idea of justice to equity and the subject of justice to the human, then the concept of justice is of no use to us whatsoever in the necessary transformation of human ecological systems and relationships. Right? It doesn't help us to have individualistic and human-based notions of justice. There's no reason to talk about multi-species justice unless we're going to expand both the concept and the subject. So I want to talk a little bit about some of that work and a bit about some of my frustrations and critiques. And then I do want to get back to place and place attachments and place relations, and then some of the obstacles, and we'll see how much time I have on that. So I've already talked a bit about the plurality of concepts. The one thing we didn't talk about very much today is capabilities. And I'll keep coming back to this in part because I'm going to argue against Martha Nussbaum in her absence, which I do in my head all the time. But one of the things we didn't really talk about, we talked about equity, we talked about about recognition, we've talked about participation, but capabilities to me is crucial because it's not just about rights, and it's not just about that sort of interpersonal recognition and participation. It's about the basic things that we need in order to construct a functioning life. Right? What do we need in order to have integrity in our bodies, in our systems, and to have the functioning? So for humans, it's obvious. It's not just rights, it's food, it's shelter, it's water, it's health, and it's relations, right? And that's really crucial, right? One of the basic human capabilities is a relational capability. So I think capabilities, in addition to recognition and participation and all of that, is crucial and comes into play in a big way, for me anyway, when we talk about multi-species justice. Now, on expanding the subject, yeah, I'm trained as a political theorist too, and I'm just so frustrated with this. It's not just hesitance anymore, it's active resistance. Right? The idea of justice being based on human exceptionalism, rules on contracts, right? Only humans can enter into contracts. Brian Barry on, you don't want to talk about moral equality of non-humans. Martha Nussbaum on life projects, right? Only human beings and the most sentient of animals have life projects. All kinds of people talking about, well, justice is a relationship. Justice is about reciprocity, and the non-human can't give back, as if it doesn't all the time. I know, that's my feeling exact. What the hell are you talking about? Sorry.
As if humans do.
So this is my frustration, and all human, this idea of human exceptionalism, that really gets back to Lauren's picture, and I love that picture, the ladder of intellect. I mean, just that sort of, humans are here, and it's because we are steps above, and it's always this hierarchy. So thanks for that picture. I'll have to come back to that. And anytime I've suggested justice to the kind of non-human entities that we're talking about here, not just non-human animals, but rivers, and I did have this argument with Martha Nussbaum at one point, all of these points of human exceptionalism are thrown back at me. The liberal individual is sacred. And so for me, the liberal individual is really the theoretical problem. And I'm really I'm of two minds here. I mean, I either spend a lot of time taking down the liberal individual, or we just ignore the hell out of it and move on, right? But I feel like it needs to be taken down, and I'll spend a little bit of time on that. And I think the problem for me is that the individual is a fiction. We know it's a fiction. It's always been a fiction, but it's taken as something that's real. It's just become more and more difficult for me to hear claims that rivers don't have life projects. At the same time, people are making claims about the unencumbered individual, right, which doesn't exist, right? Rivers have life projects. Individuals are not unencumbered, right? So there's just that contrast. And so it's really heartening for me today, right, to hear my people, Petra on dismantling human exceptionalism, everyone getting at the reality of relational ontologies, or that thrown togetherness. I really like that idea. So that recognition gives me a bit of hope for expanding the concept and subject. So I want to talk a little bit about this liberal individual fiction, but the last time I did this in a room of liberal justice theorists, the shit really hit the fan. And it's actually the last time that I gave a paper criticizing liberal individual. It was about 3 or 4 years ago at a Human Development and Capabilities Conference in Tokyo, and I was done at that point. I just didn't feel like arguing about it anymore. And what I talked about was the idea of the individual being a fiction because we're never alone. Right? Even in our own perception of our individual. One of the things that we've learned, one of the many things that we've learned, is that one ecosystem that we maintain within our own bodies, the microbiome that lives in our gut, illustrates not only that we are made up of a host of other beings, but that those beings and their relationship impact our health, our behavior, our mood, our identity, right? What it means to be us is determined by an ecosystem that we keep inside of us. We are not an individual. We are, among other things, a host for ecosystems. And so our identity and our conception of well-being is down to the human body as a viable host ecosystem. And the breakdown of that ecosystem has a real impact on our identity, our well-being. Right? The breakdown is an injustice. And on the other hand, and much more obvious, no individual can survive isolated from the everyday entanglements and relations that we have with the rest of the natural world. Food, water, air, bacteria, all of these things, which we call resources, and ecosystem services is just a terrible way to talk about this. They are all parts of systems in which we are enmeshed. Again, thankfully, and maybe it was worth waiting a couple of years to get back to this, there is an increasing recognition here. And some of it comes out of environmental justice movements and the growth of the understanding of environmental injustices as not just another symptom of social injustice, but environmental injustice as being about the lack of a functioning ecosystem that is necessary for any reality of social justice. I think there's been a growth of that. There's also been a growth of the kind of sustainable materialist movements that I've been writing about that directly embrace and address the reality of ecological flows, of materials, of food, of energy, of clothing. And those movements and those activists talk directly about destructive flows and the damage of the ignorance of entanglements and work to develop more functioning relationships and systems that provide for basic needs without undermining the integrity of ecological systems. So there's a lot more going on here, I think, on both of this. But the problem in political theory is still that the vast majority of writing remains based on a world that doesn't exist while ignoring the world that does. And yeah, so there's something to say about utopia there that we can come back to. Anyway, so I've done a bit of that. There's all kinds of, I'm not the first one to talk about them, I have all kinds of theoretical influences, Deb Bird-Rose and conversations with Val Plumwood. There's some American ecologists or ecological thinkers. One of the first was Rodman, who really got me thinking about the recognition of the thinking of other animals and all that. So that's been an influence. And then, of course, the other influence, again, is environmental justice movements. And environmental justice movements were the first for me to sort of push this idea of the subject, not just the concept, where I got all of that, but the subject as well, because environmental justice movements talk about collective subjects. They talk about communities, right? And the reality of community as a subject of justice, as a subject of injustice. And that collective ontology, that relational ontology, it's there. It's been there. It's been there in climate justice since 2002 in Bali, right? That kind of language, that kind of frame, that it's not just the liberal individual, it is the collective, it is the community that is being harmed, it is the community's dignity that's being harmed, it's the community's functioning that's being undermined. That kind of language is what has influenced me. And then, of course, there's all of the work in indigenous communities and indigenous environmental justice about relationality with the non-human. And the undermining of the functioning of the non-human is linked to the functioning of the human. There is no distinction between those, right? It is the relationship that is the subject of justice, is a great way to put it, right? So this, again, it's not new. It's not new theoretically. It's not new in the theorizing of movements as well. And so that's where I get that kind of inspiration. So I guess I'll turn now to talk a little bit about capabilities, because this is kind of the language that I was pulling out of movements and the language that fits both the human and the non-human. And it's the idea of the integrity and functioning of not just individuals, but a range of beings, a range of relationships, a range of systems. And this is where the justice comes in, and the way that human activity can interrupt, corrupt, or undermine those ways of life. So injustice to me, injustice to the non-human, injustice to those relationalities comes with the thwarting of the simple attempt to live and reach goals. I just don't think we need sentience or individuality in order to make that sort of claim. So now, let me turn a little bit to place. Where am I on time? 5 minutes. That'll work. So, making the connection to the theme for the day, the importance of place and attachments to place has come up in a host of environmental justice battles, mining and gas, and Lauren and I and Jason Byrne wrote about this a couple of years ago. In one of those chapters that just disappears and people don't cite it, and I don't understand that. It's a really good piece. Thanks, Lauren. So in environmental justice battles, a number of ways that EJ has been communicated, like in food justice movements and community discussions of justice and adaptation policy, all these places where place and attachments to place are coming up. And in all of those cases, from food movements to adaptation planning, attachment relates to both the relationship with the non-human and the ability of non-human sectors of the community to continue to function. I mean, that concern, that attention, that recognition is there. And so then the question becomes the question of injury. And for me, the importance of place attachments and of the harm, and the importance is that attachment to place and the harm done to that attachment and to that relationship. There's more attention to the way that climate change and environmental shocks more generally are systematically disrupting the qualities of place that make it special to inhabitants. That's a quote from G. We hear a lot about the emotional dimensions of place. This is work that Petra has been doing, and Leslie Head and others. There's a recent paper here about reef grief, just that whole idea of what it means for that reef to turn into one of the world's largest living systems, one of the world's largest dying systems. There's a lot of this kind of work about loss and stress and grief and hopelessness and alienation that comes with that interruption of the functioning of the relationship between human and non-human, human and place. And I think that's exactly why this idea of attachment is crucial, because it's clearly a necessary capability for the realization of a functioning life, the realization of a life of integrity. And that interruption, as with any interruption of any capability, is a loss that we have to understand as an injustice. And again, not only a human story, not just about human loss, but a story about the interruption of relationships, social, ecological, and interspecies. I think there's a lot of place for this in a capabilities approach, but I'll skip that and talk briefly about 3 obstacles to thinking in this way. And this is the stuff, it doesn't keep me up at night, it just keeps me from really writing about it when people talk about these things, I guess. So and this is why today is hopeful. So one of the things that Nussbaum has said about why this kind of concept of multi-species justice won't work is because we'll never have this sort of liberal overlapping consensus, right? We'll never get people to vote on this, right? Getting to a question that was brought up earlier. It's so beyond the pale. And I just don't think that's true anymore. There's so much concern. I mean, look at the outpouring of concern after the fish kill in the Murray-Darling, and that recognition of the relationship between communities and the non-human that live there. Look at all of the vote. I mean, the story I tell here is, I lived in Arizona for way too long, and it's racist to the core, and it hates brown people, and it's just happy to lock them up. And yet, even in Arizona, there was a vote to do away with the pens for pigs. Right? There's more concern for animals and that kind of justice for the freedom and integrity of an animal body than there is for brown people in Arizona, but there's the possibility there. I mean, if Arizona can vote for things like that, it's possible anywhere is the point. So I think that idea of there never being an overlapping consensus is just a cop-out. And I think the more we hear about this and the more we have groups like this together, it's not beyond belief to imagine such an overlapping consensus. The second objection really has to do with this idea, and again, this is from Nussbaum, and again, the argument that non-human entities don't have a life project that can be thwarted. And it's just such an anti-ecological idea. And I mean, let's talk about that. I don't have time to get into it now, but if a river doesn't have a life project, if an ecosystem, if a Tasmanian forest system doesn't have a life project, I don't know what the definition of life project is, other than this really narrow, liberal idea of a good life that we design with our rational selves, which is a falsehood anyway, given, again, the media and all of that. So I don't buy that objection either. And then the third objection, and this came up after a book a decade ago, is, well, if you give the conception of justice, if you expand the concept of justice to a variety of other subjects, all you're going to get is conflict. Right? You're going to get conflict not just between human beings, but between human and non-human, between individual and collective. It's just going to be a mess. And ideal theorists, analytic political theorists, if there's conflict there, if it's not possible for everybody to get everything, then it just doesn't work and it falls. And I just don't buy that, and that's why I'm not an analytic political philosopher. In the real world, it's conflict, right? Even, as Danny said, even in human rights, applying this very individualistic, human-based notion, we still have conflict. We don't have the realization of those, right? So it doesn't help to have a perfect theory. And so for me, the idea of conflict is exactly what we want, because that brings the recognition of those conflicts, the recognition of what's necessary for different individuals and systems to live, and the necessity of taking from a system in order to live. We have to eat, we have to take things out of systems, right? We build things and we will take things out of systems. There are conflicts, they're real, right? But that's the potential. Right? The recognition of those conflicts means the possibility of democratic deliberation across those conflicts. And so that's the necessity, not denying that we're going to have conflicts, but embracing conflict and actually talking about it and thinking about what it means that we live in these relationalities where anything that we do and anything that any animal or non-human system does is going to have an impact on others. That's what that relationality means. It's not a stable thing. It's a relationship. And that's the relationship that we can at least think about from a justice framework. How can we take for our basic needs without undermining the integrity and functioning of others who have similar needs? So that's a lot of work, and I'll leave it there.